In Isaiah 11:7, it reads, "The cow will graze with the bear, their young will lie down together, and the lion will eat straw like the ox." In Isaiah 65:25, it reads, "The wolf and the lamb will feed together, and the lion will eat straw like the ox." So this is telling us that the Creator is going to end all violence, including that among animals that are currently predatory. They will no longer have that instinct and behavior. All animals will be herbivores. So this corresponds to the Garden of Eden, where there was also no violence, and Genesis 1:29 tells us that plants are to be our food. A question that often comes up in objection to anyone advocating humans leaving animals alone, aka veganism, is, well, why are there predator animals? They'll often just say, well, animals eat animals, ignoring that herbivores do exist, right? They just talk about animals as if they're all carnivores, or all carnivores and omnivores, as if herbivores don't even exist. But regardless, even if they were to be more exact and ask why do carnivores and omnivores exist alongside herbivores, as a question, to justify their own eating of animal flesh, they should actually see their own question as a logical fallacy in defense of abuse, namely appeal to nature. So all logical fallacies are used in defense of abuse because there is no sensible defense for abuse. And this is actually logical proof that God is loving, because he's made reality in such a way that if you even try to defend abuse, you'll inevitably be stating something that fits into one of three categories. First category would be assumptions, and all assumptions are irrational, right? You're believing something to be true that you don't actually know is true, right? Which is irrational. The second category would be false equivalencies. So you're saying two things are the same when they're not. So it's just a falsehood, a lie. And the third category is just abuse of speech. So that's like using evil to try and justify evil. You're just speaking abusively, oftentimes in the form of ad hominem, or just slandering the person, as if that is a good argument, and it's not. So it's just all nonsense, to put it simply. These three categories of logical fallacies are nonsense. Logical fallacies are nonsense. And they're always used in defense of human carnism. So, like I said, oftentimes people will say, oh, well, carnivores exist, right? And again, that's literally a logical fallacy called appeal to nature, assuming that because something exists in nature, it's morally good, which is just nonsense, right? Why would you assume that because a lion exists, that lion is now your moral teacher. And it's especially nonsensical because why not look at the rhinoceros or the horse, right? Why not look at the herbivore and look at them as your moral teacher? Why focus on the predator and then put them on a pedestal and say, oh, look, this predator exists, therefore it's okay for me to murder sentient beings? Like, that's just literal nonsense. It's assuming something is good simply because it's in nature. Again, appeal to nature. Another common one is just appeal to history or appeal to tradition. It's like, oh, well, my family has always done this, or, this has been done for centuries. Again, that's just nonsense. Like, in a moral context, thinking that something is good or bad, loving or abusive, simply because, if you're determining whether something is morally good or morally bad based on how many times it's been done, like, that is nonsensical. It's just ethically dumb. The moral good is loving action, befriending love, right? The moral evil is abuse. That's the truth of the matter of ethics. It has nothing to do with whether the action was done many times in the past. It's completely irrelevant. So this appeal to tradition is just another assumption, assuming that because something has been done repeatedly for a long time, it's therefore good. And of course, I got to give the obvious example of slavery. Like, yeah, slavery was done for a long time. It still exists today in other forms. But just because something is going on for a long time has nothing to do with whether it is abusive or not. So another common counter-argument to leaving animals alone is appeal to authority. Air quotes on authority. And appeal to popularity, which usually go hand in hand, since the herd usually follows whatever the so-called authorities say, because they were conditioned to believe following authority equals being a good person, especially in the education system. That's a belief instilled in children. But oftentimes people will say, well, I have to eat animal flesh because, my doctor says so, or because, this authoritative book says so. And again, that's just assuming that whoever you deem authority, whoever you think is, the most knowledgeable or wise, you're just assuming that they are going to give the perspective that is most aligned with the moral good, most aligned with love. And that's nonsense. It doesn't make any sense. Why would you detach yourself from the particulars of the action and just observe whether it's loving or abusive, and turn off your conscience and replace it with this assumption? In this case, that happens to also be a form of idol worship, whether that be of a current so-called authority, or you say, oh, well, there's some other passages in the Bible that say eating meat is just fine, so I'm going to make an idol of whoever wrote that, whatever scribe wrote that, whatever so-called apostle wrote that. It says here that Jesus ate fish, so I'm just going to believe that. I'm just going to believe that someone writing lies about Jesus is just impossible, and that everything in this book is perfect, inerrant Word of God. These are just huge assumptions. And again, all assumptions are irrational, so it's just nonsense. So returning to those passages in Isaiah, I do believe that is a true prophecy. So then a question might be, well, what's up with this time we're in now, right? Original paradise, Garden of Eden, there was no violence, and then the future, the Creator is going to make it non-violent again. So, what's going on right now? Well, it's a good question. Just ask yourself that. What might be a plausible explanation? Well, how did Adam and Eve lose paradise? Thinking independently of, the mainstream church narrative on that story, just focus in on certain elements at play here. And for the sake of argument, imagine that my interpretation is valid here. The Creator told Adam and Eve to not eat of this tree that we're told is just the knowledge of good and evil. Now, to just stop there and think, well, then the Creator doesn't want humans to know the knowledge of good and evil is obviously nonsense. It's just really dumb. But what makes the story make sense is there happened to be this serpent on that tree, right? And what was that serpent doing? Well, basically he was saying lies, right? Slander in particular. So you've heard the idea of the worm in the apple, right? The corrupted fruit, the poisoned apple or the poisoned fruit, right? So this is corrupted knowledge of good and evil, right? So rather than trusting the Creator, they went for this corrupted knowledge of good and evil, and that led to their downfall. That led to them losing paradise, and then that led them to think killing animals is okay. So we have free will, right? He didn't stop them from eating that. He said don't do it, but he didn't physically stop them from doing it, right? He gave them agency to make their own choice, right? So that's the space we're in now. That's the era or age or however you want to designate it. Satan's little season, Satan's short season, or whatever eschatological term you want to use. We're in a period of time where we can choose between love and abuse, right? So yeah, the lion exists out there, but so does the rhinoceros. Which one are you gonna think is doing the better choice? Like which are you gonna emulate or think is the more loving behavior? Like what is more appealing to you? Seeing that violence and suffering and pain, or just seeing that awesome animal eat some plants, And why might you not make the obvious better choice of just eating the plants too? Well, it comes back to the logical fallacies. It comes back to the appeals to tradition, to nature, to authority, right? It's all these assumptions, along with false equivalencies, as I mentioned, is another category of logical fallacy. People will say the ridiculous false equivalency of, oh, well, you have to kill plants to eat as a vegan. So it's the same thing. Biting an apple is the same as slitting a throat of a lamb, which is just obviously false and scientifically false, right? But they'll say, oh no, yeah, I think, there's some pseudoscience article I read that makes it seem like, yeah, even though they don't have a central nervous system or don't have any, clear consciousness like an animal does, I'm just gonna say, yeah, they're basically the same, they're equivalent. Therefore, no ethical difference between, biting into a carrot or, putting a spear through a fish that has pain receptors, that clearly showing distress, as I pull it out of the water and it suffocates to death. Right, I'm just gonna ignore obvious reality or ignore obvious biology and make this false equivalency between plants and animals. Eating a cherry, oh yeah, same exact thing as, slaughtering a pig. No different. It's ridiculous. It's absurd. And to think that that perspective, which is completely baseless and just nonsense, would actually hold up in your own defense is just bewildering. It's just dumb. So I say that, out of love, actually, to try and help wake you up and kind of have a reality check here and know what's going on, give you a heads up on what time you're in, basically, right? And just because what you're doing is popular, don't make that make you feel comfortable about it. Just because it's popular, it definitely doesn't mean that it's the right thing. And just because you can point to some so-called authorities that tell you you're right or tell you that this abuse is okay, it doesn't mean that it is. And just because you observe violence in nature doesn't mean the Creator actually wants you to choose that. So that's some common sense, so to speak. Some good reasoning to counter all the nonsense in support of abuse that isn't going to be in your favor, right? Because if the Creator of the universe doesn't actually want that, what do you think that means as far as the people carrying it out, right? If that wasn't part of His original design and that's not part of the future, well, how does everyone who wants to still be abusive fit into that picture, right? They don't.